Thank you for joining us on our call today. Before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping points. When joining the internet link, you will have been given the option of joining through your computer's audio or dialing in via the telephone. If you have difficulty connecting to the audio, please message the Centre for Science and Security Studies or host using the chat box. On a PC or laptop, the chat box is on the right-hand side. If you're using a phone or tablet, you'll have to toggle this view to see it. To manage the session, this is all one-way audio. All participants are currently muted, so if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box. If you're using a PC or laptop, the Q&A button is in the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you're using a smartphone or tablet, you may have to toggle this, so please have a quick look now. Please also use the opportunity to ensure that the slides are visible and minimize any features such as participant videos that you find distracting. I should also note that this presentation will use polls. All polls are anonymous, so please do not worry when voting. Today's session is called A New Approach to Insider Threat Mitigation, Lessons Learned from Counterintelligence Theory. It's planned to last for about 45 minutes, with questions and answers at the end. The session is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the session. At the end of the session, there will also be a short questionnaire for your feedback. This is useful for us to see if you like the format of today's session, or if you have any recommendations. And secondly, if you have any topics you would like covered, or have projects you would like to share with the community, so please let us know. So, without any further delay, I'm pleased to announce that today we're joined by Noelle Camp. Noelle is a member of the technical staff at the Centre for Global Security and Cooperation at Sandia National Laboratories, where she facilitates international workshops and conducts research on counterproliferation topics. Noelle, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Noelle Camp, and I'm an engineering systems professional at the Center for Global Security and Cooperations at Sandia National Laboratories. Thank you so much to King's College London for the opportunity to share with you today a little bit about what I consider to be one of the most pressing threats faced by the nuclear industry today, the threat of a malicious insider. Over the course of the next 45 minutes, I'll share with you insights and case studies from my research, applying lessons learned from the discipline of counterintelligence to insider threat mitigation within the nuclear industry. But before we get started diving into the insights from the research, I'd like to get more of a sense of where the audience is coming from when it comes to insider threat mitigation. So if you take a second to fill out this poll as to how much of a priority you believe that mitigating insider threat should be for the nuclear industry, a top priority, a mid-tier priority, or maybe not a priority at all. I'll give everyone a few more seconds to vote in case you haven't had a chance. Okay, it looks like about 85% of folks have voted, and the majority of individuals are saying that mitigating insider threat should be a top priority for the nuclear industry. And I certainly agree with that conclusion. But for those of you who don't believe that it should be a top priority, hopefully over the course of this presentation, I'll be able to convince you that insider threat mitigation is deserving of our time and our resources. One more poll before we dive in. Now, we've said that we think insider threat mitigation is a priority. But how likely do you believe it is that a malicious insider exists within your own organization right now? Give it a few more seconds for people to vote. So it looks like we have about 70% of responses coming in, and the results are definitely more varied here. Some individuals feel like it's very likely or somewhat likely that an insider might exist within their organization. But we also have a fair number of participants who fall more into the camp that it's somewhat unlikely or very unlikely that an insider exists within their organization. And I certainly understand that it's difficult to consider that one of our own colleagues within our own organization might choose to act against a facility. But as we'll see over some of the case studies that we're going to discuss in this presentation, any facility can be susceptible to insider threat, and even loyal employees may choose to commit a malicious act under the right circumstances. Let's take a little step back and go back to the basics. What is insider threat? The IAEA defines an insider as an adversary with authorized access to a nuclear facility, a transport operation, or sensitive information. There are a few characteristics of insiders that make them particularly dangerous to nuclear facilities. First, insiders have unique access, authority, and knowledge that external adversaries simply don't have. Insiders have access to a facility and the materials within that facility. They have authority and knowledge over facility operations. Insiders also hold positions of trust within an organization, making them less likely to fall under suspicion of committing a malicious act. When an external adversary decides to break into a facility, the clock immediately starts ticking. They must either steal the nuclear material or sabotage the facility and escape before being detected and caught. For insiders, time is on their side. Insiders have prolonged access to a facility, and that gives them more opportunity to select an appropriate target and more time to perform the malicious act. We'll see in a case study later on some examples of insiders who chose to commit protracted theft over the long term, stealing small amounts of nuclear material over a long period of time and taking advantage of that long-term facility access. On the right-hand side of this screen, you can see that a combination of opportunity from an insider's access, authority, and knowledge, and motivations, whether that's political, ideological, financial, or personal, results in a potential insider attempt. The bottom line here is that we have allowed insiders trusted access to sensitive facilities. And because of this, they pose a unique and a significant challenge to security within nuclear facilities. The insider threat problem is made even more challenging based on a lack of case studies from which to draw lessons learned and from which to analyze within the public domain. To address this challenge, nuclear security professionals have sought insights from other comparable high-value, high-security industries, including the casino and the pharmaceutical industries, high-value jewelry heists, and more. My research indicates that another potential industry from which to draw insights and that provides a useful corollary to insider threats is counterintelligence. What is counterintelligence? Counterintelligence relates to actions taken to combat foreign espionage. US Executive Order 12333 defines counterintelligence as information gathered and activities conducted to protect against espionage. There are several aspects of counterintelligence that are notably similar to insider threat mitigation. Both disciplines occur within a high security atmosphere. For counterintelligence, that's often the intelligence community, or military or diplomatic facilities. For insider threats, that's nuclear facilities that have involved a wide variety of physical protection measures. Both counterintelligence and insider threat mitigation are focused on human vulnerabilities. This isn't technology going haywire. These are individual humans who have decided to act against a facility. And the complex web of motivations and incentives that drive their behavior is important to understand for mitigation. In both disciplines, the individual involved has some combination of access, authority, and knowledge unique to them that allows them to more easily commit a malicious act. It's important to note, however, that counterintelligence is different from insider threat mitigation in several notable ways. The first is that by definition, counterintelligence requires a foreign nexus. To be a spy, you are necessarily working on behalf of a foreign intelligence entity or a terrorist organization. Whereas insider threats may be working alone. They may be working in conjunction with an external organization, but they may also be working completely alone, motivated by the prospect of personal financial gain or the desire to commit revenge against the facility where they work. Additionally, counterintelligence seeks primarily to protect information, intangible information, oftentimes classified or sensitive. Insider threat mitigation, on the other hand, deals primarily with tangible special nuclear material. I noted earlier that there are very few case studies within the public domain for insider threat within nuclear facilities. The same is not true of counterintelligence. The literature on counterintelligence reflects a long history of practice and evolution, including guides for best practices for counterintelligence, including the 10 Commandments of CI and the recent book release To Catch a Spy by James Olson. There are also hundreds of real-world case studies available in the public domain from which to draw insights. There are firsthand accounts of espionage from the spies themselves, such as I Was Cicero or My 10 Years as a Counterspy. There are accounts written by counterintelligence investigators who actually worked on the cases, such as True Believer about Anna Montez or 3 Minutes to Doomsday, which chronicles the Clyde Conrad spy ring. And there are well-researched historical biographies, such as The Spy in the Russian Club and The Spy's Son. In addition to these accounts, the Defense Personnel and Security Research Center, or PERSIREC, also maintains a case study database of hundreds of counterintelligence case studies, primarily from the United States, and they've conducted large-scale data analysis looking for trends across all of these cases. The wide variety of available cases within the public domain makes counterintelligence a potentially useful discipline from which to draw insights. This chart outlines some of the conceptual and practical similarities that we argue makes counterintelligence useful when thinking about insider threat mitigation. Both counterintelligence and insider threat mitigation deal with a human threat. They both face extremely high consequences of failure, whether that's loss of critical or national security information or the prospect of nuclear or radiological release. The mitigation goals are centered around ensuring that these consequences don't come to pass. Both disciplines also feature a preventive and a protective function, and counterintelligence also has a robust investigative function. Both of these disciplines occur in high value, high security operational environments, and both offer the potential for collaboration. In counterintelligence, that's often in the form of spy rings or networks. And in insider threat mitigation, it can be in terms of insider rings or also in collusion with external adversaries. For this study, we looked at both counterintelligence case studies and case studies of insider threat within nuclear facilities to complete a comparative analysis. For the counterintelligence case studies, we chose 10 cases spanning from 1941 to 2010 and drew only from open source information. These cases were selected in consultation with counterintelligence professionals to exhibit a wide range of lessons learned and profiles of spies. The cases are composed of German, British, Swedish, and American cases representing a wide range of nationalities. If you look at the photos below, you may recognize some of them. Some of them are extremely well known, such as the first picture there, Aldrich Ames, possibly the most notorious spy in US history, but others are less well known, such as Jim Nicholson or Sharon Scranage. For the insider threat case studies, we were more limited just based on the fact that there are very few insider threat case studies available to draw from. We chose from limited cases within the public domain, and we chose these cases because they contained sufficient detail in order to facilitate a full analysis. These cases come from a study conducted by King's College London along with Los Alamos National Laboratories. They represent both historical and contemporary cases from the United States, Belgium, and the former Soviet Union. And you can see here, we don't even have photographs of all the insiders. And in some cases, like in the last photo, we don't even have a photo of the associated facility. So this really speaks to the difference in the level of information available between counterintelligence case studies and case studies of insider threat. So I'd like to take the opportunity to ask the audience, how familiar are you with insider threat case studies in the nuclear industry? Are you familiar with several cases? Maybe you recognize some of the individuals on the last slide. Have you heard of one or two? Or maybe you haven't heard of any at all. Give it another few seconds here. Don't forget to vote. Okay, we're sitting at about 80% participation, and it looks like the majority of individuals in this call are not familiar with any cases, which actually I'm very excited to share with you a couple cases today. But even for those who are familiar with several cases, hopefully you will learn about a case that you're not already familiar with over the course of this presentation. The methodology for this study involved applying a 7 criteria rubric to elicit lessons learned from the case studies and compare trends across both the counterintelligence case studies and the case studies of insider threat. On the left-hand side, we have the element that was elicited from the case study. And on the right-hand side, we have the implications for insider threat mitigation. As one example, we looked at the maturity of the reporting culture within a facility, meaning if an employee was aware of suspicious behavior or aware of the Insider Act itself, did they come forward and report their suspicions? And we looked at this to provide insight into the operational environment and its susceptibility for manipulation by malicious acts. So that's just one example of the 7 criteria that we looked at, and you can read the others. I'll dive into more detail when we get into the case studies. Now for the results. I recognize this is a bit of an overwhelming chart, and I'm not going to walk through the whole thing, so don't worry. But this is just to give you an idea of what it actually looked like when we applied the 7 criteria rubric to each of the case studies. So across the top here, we have the 7 criteria, and then across the side, we have the 10 case studies from counterintelligence. And these are the results from the 7 insider threat case studies. The same rubric was applied to both case databases. Next, I'm going to share with you a few case studies to demonstrate how we applied the 7 criteria rubric to each of the cases. I'll start with 2 counterintelligence case studies from database 1, and then we'll look at 2 insider threat case studies from dataset 2. The first case we'll talk about is the case of Glenn Michael Sutherland, who was a US naval photographer who spied on behalf of the Soviet Union. When Glenn Sutherland began his espionage for the USSR, he was a Navy photographer with relatively little access to sensitive or classified information that would have been interesting to his Soviet handlers. However, over the course of his career with the Navy, he was steadily promoted and eventually became a naval reservist at a secure facility in the United States that dealt with highly classified satellite communications and satellite imagery. The Glenn Sutherland case shows that insiders might use promotions or lateral moves to gradually increase their opportunity to commit a malicious act. Glenn Sutherland had a variety of motivations for stealing information. Firstly, he was disgruntled by the US military's treatment of enlisted soldiers. He felt that he was not appropriately treated by the US military and wanted to seek revenge against them. Additionally, he had very strong ideological sympathies with the Soviet Union, which he shared with those around him that he was an avowed communist. There was also certainly a financial motivation to his espionage. He was paid handsomely for his services to the Soviet Union, and he gifted his friends and family lavish jewelry and paid for plane tickets to international locations. He initially volunteered his services. So like many of the spies that we looked at within the data set, Glenn Michael Sutherland was a volunteer. He volunteered to Soviet intelligence services while he was stationed overseas with the US Navy. He primarily accessed the information that he stole over the course of his normal duties. He had access to a wide variety of classified information in his position at the secure facility as a reservist, but he also took advantage of lax security within the facility to obtain additional information. For example, Sutherland would often come in late at night. The facility had no way to keep track of when individuals entered or exited the facility, allowing him to enter the building at night when no one else was around, and he could go into other colleagues' offices and seek out additional information. In this case, monitoring and a 2-person rule to prevent one individual from accessing highly classified material alone would likely have benefited the facility and limited the extent of Sutherland's espionage. This case was certainly a failure of reporting culture. Sutherland's colleagues failed to report multiple indicators of espionage, including his unusual work hours, undue affluence, not in line with a salary that was not in line with what he should have been paid as a reservist, actual criminal behavior. He was arrested for sexual harassment, and suspicious foreign travel. This case was also a failure of the background investigation process. After Sutherland began committing espionage, he was eventually interviewed for a top secret clearance with the United States government, went through the full background investigation process. Investigators failed to uncover any of the red flags I mentioned above, including his actual criminal record. Investigators also discounted reports from Sutherland's ex-wife, who came forward to state that she was suspicious of some of her ex-husband's behaviors. And they botched the initial interview when they finally caught on to the fact that something wasn't right, allowing Sutherland to successfully defect to the Soviet Union, where he lived for several years and eventually committed suicide. The next case study I'll share is another from dataset 1, so a counterintelligence case study. And this is the case of Anna Montez. Anna Montez was a senior analyst working on Cuban issues for the Defense Intelligence Agency. She had a very high level of access, authority, and knowledge, and was known within the intelligence community as, quote, the Queen of Cuba. Anna was ideologically motivated to spy for the Cuban government. She had a strong affinity for the Cuban people and believed that US foreign policy in the region was morally wrong. She was recruited by Cuban intelligence while working for the United States Department of Justice and was encouraged by her Cuban handlers to apply for a position at DIA, where she would have access to more interesting classified information. Anna had a unique way of accessing the information and passing it along to her handlers. She memorized classified information accessed during her normal duties, sometimes memorizing entire reports before going home and typing them up on her laptop to send them via encrypted communication to her Cuban handlers. Despite the fact that she had access to significant amounts of classified information just over the course of her normal duties as an analyst, she also sought to expand that access whenever possible, inviting herself to conferences and attempting to get put on high-level projects, even when she didn't have a need to know. This is one of the few case studies in the dataset that exhibits a strong reporting culture. After receiving an educational counterintelligence brief, one of Anna Montez's colleagues came forward to report his suspicions about her to a counterintelligence professional based on the fact that she was attempting to gain access to information when she didn't have a need to know, and she had vocal anti-US sentiments. This jump-started the investigation. So really it was a success of both the reporting culture and a success of the educational programming at DIA. However, there were several failures involved with the case as well. This was another case in which there was a failure of a background investigation. Anna's background investigation for DIA failed to uncover multiple red flags, including extensive past drug use and the fact that she had lied about her educational attainment. There was also a protective failure, as DIA failed to appropriately compartment information, allowing Anna to gain access to information that she otherwise shouldn't have been able to. After a successful interagency investigation, Anna was eventually arrested and is currently serving time in a facility in Fort Worth, Texas, with an expected release date of 2023, so coming up. So for those of you who said that you've never heard of any insider threat case studies in the nuclear industry, you will leave this presentation having heard of at least two. And the first that I'll talk about from dataset 2 is Leonid Smirnov. Leonid Smirnov was a chemical engineer at Lush Production Association in Russia. He was responsible for weighing and dispensing highly enriched uranium at the facility. And he had worked at the facility for more than 25 years prior to becoming an insider. This case really demonstrates that even loyal employees may be susceptible to becoming an insider threat under the right circumstances. In Smirnov's case, these motivations were financial. After the fall of the Soviet Union, workers at nuclear facilities faced serious economic repercussions. The economy was suffering and workers went unpaid for long periods of time, including Smirnov. His financial desperation led him to commit nuclear theft against the facility. So this case demonstrates that national level events, such as the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the economy, may drive insider activity. Leonid Smirnov was able to access highly enriched uranium over the course of his normal duties as a chemical engineer. He was also allowed to work with the material alone. So while colleagues were out of the room, he began collecting small amounts of highly enriched uranium, placing it in a vial and taking it home, where he stored it in a lead container on his balcony. He conducted 30 to 35 diversions over a several-month period of small amounts of nuclear material, making it more difficult for the facility to detect him. In fact, there is no evidence that any of Smirnov's colleagues were aware of or even suspected that theft was occurring at the facility. This is due in part to inadequate nuclear material accounting and control practices. The facility's accounting and control practices were so poor that they didn't even know that any nuclear material was missing from the facility. Further, the lack of a two-person rule, allowing Smirnov to work with the material alone, and insufficient physical protection measures, such as the lack of radiation detectors at entrances and exits, further facilitated Smirnov's theft. The facility never realized any of the material was missing, and strangely, Smirnov ended up being arrested with highly enriched uranium on his person in a chance and completely unrelated encounter with police. He was arrested and sentenced to a few years probation, and after finishing his time, he became a passionate advocate for nuclear security. He's done several interviews about what drove him to commit this act. The last case study I'll share is of David Leonid Dale, who was a temporary subcontractor for GE nuclear power plants in Wilmington, North Carolina, employed as a chemical technician. Unlike Smirnov, who had a fairly high level of access, authority, and knowledge, David Leonid Dale had very limited access and authority within the facility, but he had a strong knowledge of facility operations and facility materials. He was driven by disgruntlement and financial prospects. Disgruntlement because his contract as a temporary subcontractor was coming to an end, and his brother later told investigators that he was depressed about the fact that he would be out of work. He also planned to steal the material and blackmail the facility for money, and planned to use the money from the theft to, quote, take his girlfriend out to dinner. So relatively modest financial ambitions. His decision for action was the upcoming end of his contract, and he took advantages of weaknesses in the security system at the facility to break into the uranium store and steal the material. There were several notable failures of the physical protection system. David Leonid Dale usually worked on the day shift, but he came in with the night shift that day and used his Florida driver's license rather than a badge. It looked similar to a badge, so he was able to enter a restricted area. The security guards were not checking closely enough to realize that his Florida driver's license was not a real badge. He drove through a temporarily removed fence in order to park next to a building containing uranium oxide, and entered the uranium store through an unlocked door that was supposed to be locked. Colleagues on the night shift, despite the fact that he didn't normally work the night shift, either did not notice or failed to report his activity. David Leonid Dale successfully stole the material and wrote a note blackmailing the facility manager, stating that he planned to disperse the material if they didn't give him money. The plant was closed while the FBI conducted an investigation, and they were able to find and arrest Dale in part based on handwriting analysis from the note that he wrote. However, the closure of the facility resulted in an approximately $1 million loss to the facility. It was closed for only a few days. So this really illustrates how devastating these insider events can be for a facility. In this case, all the material was recovered. There was no radiological release, but the economic consequences for this facility were severe. Now that we've discussed some of the case studies and you've seen how the rubric is applied to each of the cases, I will share with you some of the major takeaways from our research and the trends that we observed across both sets of cases. So the first criteria we looked at was position or title. And we found that both data sets, in the counterintelligence data set and in the insider threat data sets, included a wide variety of positions. So we had individuals that had very high levels of authority. For example, Anna Montez, that we just discussed, was a very senior analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency. But we also had individuals that had very low levels of authority. For example, Sharon Scranage, who was a clerk with the CIA. We found that individuals with high levels of authority in both data sets leveraged that authority in order to more effectively commit a malicious act, which makes sense taking advantage of the resources that were available to them. But we also found that in the cases where individuals had a low organizational status, that low organizational status may actually have enabled their activity to go unnoticed because other folks in the facility didn't think it was possible that with their low status, they would be able to commit a malicious act. Both data sets included examples of multiple collaborating spies or collaborating insiders from different levels of the organizational hierarchy working together towards a common goal. In these cases, the varied access, authority, and knowledge of the group ended up being an asset. So in one case of multiple collaborating insiders at a Russian facility, they were able to take individuals from different parts of the facility and take advantage of their different access to materials, financial information, etc., in order to facilitate the act. In dataset two of the cases involved a temporary contractor, which was an interesting kind of minor trend that we observed. The temporary nature of the work likely shaped the timeline in both of these cases, as the individuals necessarily had to commit the malicious act prior to the end of their contract. It also provided a potential motivation for the Leonid Dale theft, as he was depressed over the upcoming end of his contract and the fact that he would be out of a job. Next, I'm going to talk about motivations. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to guess what you think the most common motivation is for spies and insiders. And then I'll share with you what we actually found in our results. I'll give you a couple more seconds here. Don't forget to vote if you haven't already. All right, so it looks like there's a wide variety of responses here, but most people think that financial motivations are the most common for spies and insiders. In our data set, that is reflected. So we did see that financial motivation was the most common for both spies and insiders within our data set. Cases in both data sets demonstrated undue affluence through lavish purchases. So for spies, they were receiving a good deal of money, high salaries from the foreign intelligence entities they were working with. And for insiders, if they sold the nuclear material they stole, they were coming into quite a bit of money. And this often resulted in extremely lavish purchases inconsistent with the individual's normal income. In several of the cases, this actually helped to eventually catch the insider or the spy. Interestingly, in dataset 2, we also saw that several insiders were willing to commit malicious acts for what we would consider relatively modest financial ambitions. I talked about Leonid Dale, who just wanted to take his girlfriend out to dinner. Leonid Smirnov told investigators that he wanted to buy a new stove and a new refrigerator. So it really doesn't take much in terms of a financial motivation to lead people to commit nuclear theft. Other motivations present in both data sets included ideology and disgruntlement. So if you answer that on the poll, you're certainly on the right track. We saw those in both data sets as well. In terms of recruitment or decision for action, how did these individuals actually get involved in either espionage or theft or sabotage? We saw that most cases across both data sets were internally motivated. For spies, most of them were volunteers. So although they eventually received direction from handlers and were working with an outside organization, the individual decision to begin spying was made internally on an individual level. For insiders, this was true as well. Most of the insiders we looked at were working alone, and they decided internally, without any kind of external motivation from another group, to begin to commit a malicious act. Both data sets included examples of major life events that triggered the activity. These triggers included divorce, denied promotion, reduction of salary, and termination. To us, this suggests that events in an individual's personal life or within their work life may affect the decisions that they ultimately make within the workplace. We found that the majority of insiders and spies leveraged their normal everyday access to access either the material that they eventually stole or the information that they compromised. This was one of our most significant findings, as so much of insider threat mitigation relies on tracking anomalies within individual behavior. But this finding suggests that tracking anomalies may be insufficient if malicious acts are camouflaged by an individual's ordinary responsibilities. In only one counterintelligence case and one insider threat case, individuals physically broke into a restricted area. And in both of these cases, as you might expect, the spy or the insider didn't have another method of obtaining sensitive information or material. So whenever possible, insiders worked with what they had, what was easily accessible to them. And if they didn't have sensitive information or material, then they would resort to breaking in. We saw that reporting culture across both of the data sets was unfortunately very weak. In fact, in the insider threat database, there was not one successful example of reporting culture across all of the cases. In dataset 1, the counterintelligence dataset, successful reporting culture generally resulted in positive outcomes for the investigation. This suggests a potential benefit for insider threat mitigation from employing more robust facility-wide training and user-friendly reporting systems. For preventive and protective measures, we saw mostly failures across both data sets. The first failure that really was notable was failures of background investigations. In dataset 1, nearly everyone in the dataset received some kind of a background investigation, but these investigations were woefully insufficient. They failed to uncover a whole host of issues, including past drug use, falsified education, anti-US views in the US cases, and criminal history. In dataset 2, it's unclear how many of the insiders may have received any kind of investigation at all, whether that's an initial background investigation or a subsequent reinvestigation. But there were certainly red flags in the backgrounds of many of the insiders that should have been caught if an appropriate background investigation had been administered. Both datasets also exhibited failures of protective measures. In dataset 1, that typically related to storing information inadequately, whether that was lapses in the physical file system for information or information security practices for information that was stored online. In dataset 2, this more often manifested as physical failures, including failures of the physical protection system, as well as the access control system. In terms of investigative measures, how did the investigation proceed for counterintelligence and insider threat case studies? There was a wide diversity of approaches and outcomes, which made it difficult for us to actually discern patterns during the course of analysis. In dataset 1, we did notice that physical and electronic surveillance was a common method used to gather evidence against spies. In dataset 2, there were no notable trends, but in one-off cases, portal monitors and customs enforcement were used to identify material that had been stolen. So what have we learned from this study? What are our major conclusions and takeaways? The first important takeaway is that many of the same trends appeared across both the counterintelligence and the insider threat datasets. This supports the conception of counterintelligence, the discipline of counterintelligence, as a potentially useful corollary for insider threat mitigation. Additionally, counterintelligence education practices may provide a model for insider threat practitioners. We saw over the course of our research that reporting culture is a serious area of weakness within insider threat mitigation. And while counterintelligence certainly struggles with this as well, they have a more robust plan for dealing with it. Common practices include annual educational briefings, assigning individual counterintelligence representatives to each employee, and advertising an easy to use and in some cases anonymous reporting system where employees can come forward to report suspicious behavior without the fear of retaliation. We also found that the presence of trigger events suggests that events in an individual's personal life affect the decisions that he or she ultimately makes within the workplace. Offering employee assistance programs, such as counseling, can help employees to grapple with emotional distress that they may experience as a result of events like divorce, without turning to insider activity against the facility. Additionally, organizations should observe employees who are receiving potentially disappointing news, such as being demoted, not receiving a promotion, reduction in salary, or termination, to observe whether warning signs of growing disgruntlement or revenge are occurring. Finally, and most importantly, insider threat practitioners should learn from the information sharing practices within the counterintelligence community. We found that information shared within the interagency facilitated successful investigations in several of the counterintelligence cases we studied. And information sharing between nuclear facilities on case studies and mitigation best practices, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what's been seen in the past, could enhance insider threat mitigation across the globe. To conclude, case studies are an indispensable window into both the failures and the successes of the past. The nuclear community can and should learn from these mistakes to avoid committing them in the future. To conclude, I'd like to thank King's College London again for the opportunity to share with you, and to thank my co-author, Dr. Adam Williams, for all of his assistance and support during the research process. At this time, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, and I hope we'll have a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Noelle. That was really fascinating. Some really interesting, I think, case studies as well as concepts and uses there. If I can just do a quick reminder for everyone. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please do use the Q&A button rather than the chat function itself, so we can monitor these. But just while we're waiting for questions to come in, some really interesting topics there. I really quite like the results from poll 2, which showed that we quite varied results around sort of whether or not we perceived there to be threats in our organization. This, I think, hints at another sort of thing you touched on, which is we're quite reluctant maybe to consider our colleagues, people we work with, people we see day to day, people we trust, as potential threats. But we also noted, I think, the importance of reporting culture in this. Is there a balance towards this end? Is there a way in which organizations can motivate employees to report suspicious behaviors while still maintaining a sense of camaraderie?
Thanks, Carl. That's a great question. This is one of the primary challenges that the insider threat mitigation community faces. How do we encourage employees to come forward and report suspicious behavior when they see it, particularly given that these are our colleagues, these are our friends that we work with. You don't want to be a tattletale, and you don't want to ruin these relationships. So I think there are a couple things that organizations can do to promote reporting. One of them is to ensure that reports are free from the prospect of retaliation. So whether that's instituting an anonymous reporting system or just maintaining confidentiality within the insider threats practitioner community, making sure that the reports are not getting out to the wider workforce. It's really crucial that individuals are not going to have to fear being retaliated against for coming forward and making a report. I think ease of reporting system is also critical. Many employees just don't know that a reporting system exists or that they have an obligation to report. So that's where these educational insider threat or counterintelligence briefings are so important. Communicating to the workforce, here are some of the signs, here are some of the red flags that we can look for of a potential insider. And it's your obligation to report those if you see them. And here's the number to call if you encounter them. So if you follow those steps, I think a much larger percentage of the workforce will be willing to come forward and report.
Okay. So what about overall culture, where if everyone trains and the base level of expectation and you normalize it, then it's more likely to happen?
Exactly.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just going to turn to the Q&A button now. So a couple of comments from Richard Ross. So thank you, Richard. Just a polite, I guess, clarification, certainly in the UK, that the concept of insider threats also includes sensitive nuclear information.
Sure.
And yeah, I think this is something we saw certainly in the counterintelligence cases, that information was stolen rather than physical property or the like.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. That's certainly true as well, that sensitive nuclear information can also be stolen. In addition to information being stolen through counterintelligence case studies, that can be an issue in the insider threat community as well. The international community tends to put more emphasis, I would say, on theft of actual material and sabotage, just because of the potential for radiological release. But a good reminder that information, it can be powerful as well.
No, absolutely. And I think the AQ Khan case study as well is probably one of the most interesting there for those who haven't come across that case study, perhaps to look into as well. Thank you. We have a question, I think, again from Richard, really about across the data sets. Did you notice through different time periods whether or not, certainly these case studies, or hopefully more modern ones, whether or not more modern security vetting checks are more resilient? Because we noticed some failures. Is there a difference in time you see through those case studies, or is it one where we're not able to tell?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think certainly much of the technology that we use to address the insider threat has improved over time. There's a more recent case study from Los Alamos National Laboratory. Alex Maestas is the case, if you're interested in looking it up, in which a portal monitor, so a radiation detection monitor, was able to catch the fact that he was leaving the facility with radioactive materials on his person. So that's one example in which more modern technology enabled effective insider threat mitigation. I will say that even in the modern cases, not all of these principles are effectively followed. And particularly, while technology has improved with some of the protective measures, many of the preventive measures are still lacking. We see contemporary cases in which background investigations, for example, continue to fail, despite the fact that we should have best practices that are in place for conducting a background investigation. Investigators continue to miss very concerning red flags, and that's occurring both in the historical case studies that we looked at and in more contemporary case studies as well.
No, absolutely. And I know the Fort Hood shootings in the States is a recent example where quite modern techniques failed there for various reasons. So thank you. One comment from Anonymous. Nuclear operators are not conventionally responsible for counterintelligence. Does this review suggest it's necessary for counterintelligence to be factored into the DBT or RTS, for example? Or what other steps how can we make this more practical?
That's a great question. And I know that at some nuclear facilities, the counterintelligence function is separate and apart from the insider threat mitigation function. So to be honest with you, I would love to study this issue more. I don't know that I have the right answer or the right approach. I think counterintelligence is an issue that can occur in nuclear facilities, but whether the practice of counterintelligence should fall under one kind of insider threat mitigation heading, whether those two functions should be combined or kept separate and apart, I think is an open question of what actually works best.
Okay, no, and thank you. I think as well, if we're thinking about individual organizations, obviously it comes down to resource as well. So whether or not
absolutely.
The US is obviously quite privileged in the fact it's a highly industrialized and wealthy nation. So not all are in this, which I think takes us on to a couple of aggregated questions, if that's okay. So I'm going to pull together just a couple of ones. One about tools and I think processes. So one question here is, has your research touched on AI as a tool for insider threat processes? But also, in terms of the vetting and monitoring of behaviors, are there other sort of techniques which would help in this, or does it come down to standard practice?
Yeah, that's great questions. AI can be a very useful tool in establishing patterns of behavior within a facility. And some of my colleagues at Sandia are actually working on this topic right now. I think it certainly has limitations. And in one of our findings, we saw that identifying anomalies can actually be very difficult within insider threat mitigation due to the fact that insiders are mostly accessing information and materials over the course of their normal duties. So AI's function in identifying those anomalies may be somewhat limiting in terms of actually identifying insider activity. For vetting, I think one tool that is extremely useful and that we saw come up again and again in the case studies that we looked at is vetting of financial records. So that should certainly occur when a background investigation is conducted, but vetting of financial records during the reinvestigation process or once an employee fell under suspicion was extremely useful in identifying insiders who had received money from selling nuclear material and spies who were receiving a salary, who were receiving unexplained large influxes of cash that then showed up on their financial records. So certainly there are many, many tools that can be used for vetting and for continuous monitoring, but that's just one example that we saw in the data sets. Okay,
no, thank you. So, and I think just related to a third question about the idea of continuous monitoring through digitization. This can help us, but it requires that continuous monitoring.
Yes.
No, thank you. So thank you to everyone. We're coming up to the hour now, so I'm just going to take one or two questions. So Noelle, if you're able to stay on, that'd be great. Thank you. So thank you for everyone who's asked questions. And just a reminder, if you've raised your hand in the chat function or put something in the chat function, please put it into the Q&A so we can go through it. But I think just on the last couple, you mentioned preventative measures, protective measures, preventative measures. Do you think some employees could be used effectively as victims if they are a victim of cybercrime? What's the scope for being an unintentional or unintended insider?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's also an understudied element of the insider threat, and it's particularly applicable to the cyber environment. You see these phishing attacks or other mechanisms that cyber criminals are using, and employees who are loyal or committed to the organization who have no desire to commit an insider act may compromise information unwittingly. So I think this is an especially difficult problem to attack because individuals don't even realize that they're committing an insider activity. I think it goes back to a robust protective function. So trying to limit these attacks from occurring, if you have a strong cybersecurity presence at your facility, trying to limit the actual attacks that can get through, but then a strong educational component. For example, at Sandia, we receive these emails from the cyber team that attempt to trap us into clicking on a suspicious link. And then if you click on the link, it pops up and says, if you had really done this in real life, then you would have just compromised all of this information. So it's a useful tool to show the workforce what a phishing attempt actually looks like and to educate them to ensure that they're following appropriate cyber hygiene practices. So that's one way that you can kind of address the unintentional insider, but that needs to be incorporated into your annual educational materials.
Okay, so really the reporting culture should be part of a wider awareness culture, which is part of a wider overall work culture, amongst other things.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that should be a fundamental part of the organizational culture at large.
Excellent, thank you. And I think we're just my last question now. So apologies if we didn't get a chance to answer your questions. The debate has really it's really stimulated some debates. So Noelle, this is very interesting. Thank you. And really, I think just I think the idea of cyber, but also many more of us are working from home now because of the sort of global pandemic. And so just a couple of questions of, I guess, pandemic-y type related questions. So one, the pandemic is obviously causing greater economic repercussions with many businesses and the like shutting down, but also increasing politicization, with parties vying, believing and not believing, taking circumstances on it. Do you see, or how would you rate the impact of something like an epidemic on societal disruption? What does that do to your assessment for insider threats? Does that potentially increase, decrease? How does that factor into your research?
Yes, I think it's a real challenge, and it's probably the most significant threat that we're facing right now in terms of promoting insider activity. So there's several factors here. One is that employees working from home are often less cognizant of security measures while they're working from home. They're not in the office. Maybe they're not having to attend their usual educational briefings. They're not having contact with security or counterintelligence or insider threat mitigation professionals. And because of that, they get lazy, they get lax in their practice of security measures. So that's one serious issue as a result of the pandemic. But there's also the wider societal issues that are brought on by the pandemic, the economic repercussions of the pandemic, but also the psychological repercussions for many people who are facing isolation during this time. So I think it's prudent for nuclear facilities to recognize that we are in a heightened threat environment for insider threat right now, and to provide employees with resources to cope with some of these issues, to ensure that there are employee assistance programs in place. For example, offering time off for employees who maybe need to take care of their children, ensuring that there are still social activities for employees who might be suffering from isolation, ensuring that employees who are suffering from economic hardship have resources that they can turn to as well. Those are just some of the suggestions, and also ensuring that employees are keeping up to date with their security practices, and that's continued to be driven home as an important thing for the entire workforce to be participating in.
No, some interesting thoughts there. Noelle, thank you so much for letting us join your expertise today. I know it's particularly early in your neck of the woods, so thank you again. So that's been really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So for everyone else, thank you for attending today's session. I hope you enjoyed it, and please email if you have any further questions. After this, we're going to send around a very short survey, so please do take the time to fill it in so you can take from your experiences and improve the sessions. And a reminder for those of you who have done the Nuclear Security Culture Programme, we really do want to keep in touch, so please look out for the impact survey, which we send around periodically. We're looking forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which is on the 19th of November, hosted by George Foster on nuclear security considerations when decommissioning nuclear facilities. So again, thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all. Goodbye.